Well, a warm welcome to everybody to this event. This is the last of the events for ABBA Robotics Week. The team's had a busy week as they look at different aspects of robotics, including research and workshops for people to try. It's a pleasure to welcome Ian Harris this evening to talk to us. Ian has a background in industry and in academia, and he currently works in Aberystwyth Business School. And tonight he's going to consider how robots will have an impact on industry and what that means for society. So I'll just say that this event is being recorded. During the talk, we ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off, but at the end, Ian's happy to take questions, and you're very much welcome to unmute and turn on your cameras at that point. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. So the title of the talk really is, does digital transformation need a dose of social responsibility? And I thought what I'd do for this presentation is just maybe approach DT from a social science perspective. My background's in information systems implementation, business process re-engineering, but fundamentally I've been a marketer, either within industry or within academia for way too many years. So marketing's basically a societal concept. So I thought if I could frame it and have a lens of it like this, then it would be an appropriate way to do this type of talk. I also recognize that I'm not a specialist in robotics, but what I've really tried to do is I've tried to include some sort of technology in most of the sections, with the possible exception of part one. And I'm honest, this is not going to be like some really dubious O-level GCSE business studies or A-level economics part. I just need to introduce some fundamental economics, basically to baseline why there has been a progressive rush towards automation and more recently towards digital transformation. And that fundamentally comes down to a concept called the production function. And we're going to very briefly touch upon that. Then in part two, what I'd like to do is just take a look at some of the more recent industry responses to production function pressures. And I'm going to give you two examples, one of which will be the supply chain and one of which will be offshoring. And obviously ISICT supports those elements. But it's just to give you some idea that industry is responding to socioeconomic pressures. In part three, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and show an argument for. Now, there's many arguments, and the argument I'm going to put forward is just one Stalin in a murmuration, because there's obviously time constraint. But I'm going to take a look at the use of automation technologies in UK retail, and I'm going to compare some of the established incumbents with some of the new sort of emergent incumbents, particularly in food retail. And then sensibly, because digital transformation has impacts in society, we're going to take a look at just, again, a very narrow lens of a particular impact that may occur for digital transformation. So hopefully each one of these parts will take approximately 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more if I go off on a tangent. There will be the opportunity for you to take part in a quiz. If you have a smartphone ready, I've got a QR code that you can scan and do a very simple quiz as we go along. Okay, so just some assumptions. I'm coming at this from a social science perspective, and it might be slightly different to a computer science perspective. So automation is the use of technology to augment or replace human activity for a particular task. And digital transformation is the adoption of digital technology to transform services or businesses, either through replacing non-digital or manual processes with digital processes. So in simple terms, in business, what you're removing is the concept of muda. And muda is waste, and it's what the Japanese sort of management approaches of the 70s, 80s, and 90s really adopted. You're trying to remove any excess cost in the production of whatever it is you're making. That could be a commodity, a product, it could be a service, or it could be an experience. And they're all productions. And key to this is this concept of the cost of production, and really what digital transformation and automation undertakes. And this was recognized by Schumpeter in the 20s and 30s when he was evaluating Ford's production line for the Model T Ford, was fundamentally these three elements impact the profitability of the firm, but also the ability for a firm to invest in areas with the profits from those sales. So labor costs, assembly line workers, machine operators. And when I was looking at business process re-engineering, this is what we were trying to do with informational level jobs. There's automation, information transformation, and the business process re-engineering, sort of business intelligence, OLAP type stuff that I was working in a few years ago was basically trying to reduce those labor costs. Then you have material costs, of course, raw materials to actually create the product. And then you have these overhead costs, which could be the leasing of the building or the energy required to build it. But the key thing here with digital transformation is the fact that what it allows you to fundamentally to do is to actually move the labor costs to the black as opposed to the red. It allows you to spend less on labor. And Amazon know this. Back about 2 years ago, Amazon was desperately trying to automate some of its processes. The pandemic put paid to that because they just had to employ about 500,000 additional employees to cover the demand of their digitally mediated service provision. So part one, this is not going to take very long. Consumption, what is it? Well, that's what drives everything we do. So all of digital transformation is a result of consumptive practice, and consumption is defined as spending for acquisition of utility. Utility is an economic term. It just means something that you can do. So, you know, if I buy a car, I can travel. If I buy a kettle, I can boil water. That's the utility. It's seen in contrast to investing, which is basically spending for acquisition of future income. So useful to know. Why? Because the discipline I work in is looking at consumption. That's what marketing is. It's the cleanest form of business subject because it looks at the process of consuming. So if we think about supply and demand, supply is the amount of something that companies are willing to provide. Sometimes they'll provide lots, sometimes they won't provide as much as the market needs because they want a price scheme and they want to make more profit off what they're doing. Demand is the quantity of a good that consumers are willing and able to purchase at various prices. And this is very dynamic and it remains dynamic. And the pandemic was a good example. My family persuaded me that I needed an oxygen sensor just in case I got ill and I needed to measure my blood oxygen levels. And what would a product that would typically cost 15 or 20 pounds was 75 pounds. And the only products left had a tolerance of plus or minus 10%. So practically they were useless. So demand was impacting the price. And this is the classical diagram that you will see from A-level economics. And basically that blue line is the curve that's interesting. And as you move from quantity 1 to quantity 2 on the x-axis, the y-axis sees an increase in price. That doesn't always happen, but in this case, it's showing that as quantity purchased increases, so does the price, which is fine, okay? And the reason that we're discussing this is that basically individual consumers make decisions and they purchase things. And digital transformation is about allowing organizations to provide a product, service, or experience to a market, to an audience in a profitable way. And basically, as soon as a company enters the market with this digital enabled capacity, then all of a sudden everything changes. And it's called the innovator's dilemma, and it was coined in the late 90s. And if you think about Amazon, John Lewis, for example, could have responded to Amazon's threat 20 years ago. Did they? No. What are they doing now? They're diversifying into student-lets because they can't make their high street model work any longer. Because the demand is moving from retail to retail sort of in cities or in towns to retail online. And key here is that the demand directly influences supply, pricing, and the focus of the organization. And pricing is really the key determinant here because the vast majority of purchases have some sort of pricing decision in them. Now, the way that the organization designs themselves, or the firm designs themselves to produce something, impacts the firm's cost of production. And fundamentally, what digital transformation does is, through capital investment, allows them to increase their working capital because they're not spending as much money on workers. And production can mean anything, okay? So the production function is just a way of saying what human and non-human resources provide an output. And you'll know that some firms utilize more of one resource than the other because some firms can deliver products at lower prices than other firms if the product is identical. But the reality of this production function is that every firm uses a combination of different inputs to provide an output. Okay, so this is the linear function. Production function is A, B, C, D, which are factors of production. Now, there'd be 100 of those. Okay, this is a simplification. And I've got a comment. I spoke to an emeritus professor when I was preparing this presentation. And I said to Nick, Nick, I want to approach it from this perspective. What should I look at? So he said, Ian, I've got a textbook from my undergraduate days. It had just been published when I bought it. And I looked at the date and thought, blinking heck, The Theory of Economic Statics. So thank you, Nick, for that. Okay, so if you've got a smartphone and you can read a QR code, if you scan that QR code, what we should be able to do is just get the view of this audience on what the main drivers of digital transformation are. Now, I've covered just one of them, and I may have biased some of the results as a result of that. But what I'm going to try and do is go to this form and see if anybody's able to respond. And we should see these responses in real time. I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Oh, we go, we're in, excellent. So I'll just give you another 20 seconds or so to try and do this. Excellent, okay, now we're starting to fly in. And this is basically to break up the monotony of me talking at you. There's one more quiz later on, which is much, much more simple in its sort of derivation. So what we can see is pretty balanced. And this will depend on your view and what you do within the organization or what your professional expertise is. But we're looking at improved efficiency, improved decision-making, improved profitability, all being quite significant in those areas. So thank you for that. So in the industry I used to work in, it was all about decision making and how we could make more profitable decisions within organizations which were very complex. Cool, that worked better than I anticipated. Okay, so this is a key point. And the point is that digital transformation delivers higher returns to capital than labor. Now, what it means is that the companies and the shareholders of the companies that digitally transform grow more, and the workers for those firms benefit less. That's the simple point of this statement. And what I'd like you to do, if possible, is just hold that up in your head as I go through the rest of this presentation. So basically, digital transformation benefits, in particular, Jack Ma and Jeff Bezos as examples. Bernard Arnault is much more of a luxury goods provider. People always buy luxury goods during sort of pandemics or times of economic strife just to make themselves feel better. Okay, so that was the basic economics. I said it would be pretty painless. We're going to move into part two, which is how do and how have companies over time responded to pressures on the production function of using human and non-human resources to produce products and to maintain their profitability, i.e. the fact that they remain living as opposed to Woolworths, for example, that no longer exists. And there's a nice quote here from Dennis Mumby. What Dennis said was that the cost of transport determines the size of production units, the size of cities, and hence the human opportunities for leisure, choice of jobs, and the quality of life in general. Now, if you think about digital transformation in a utopian world, and we're going to get a quote from Thomas More soon, then this idea of leisure, choice of jobs, and quality of life in general is an aspirational thing. So how do you do this? Well, if we think about some of the innovations of the 20th century, I think we'd agree that the internet is staggeringly powerful in its reach and its impact in what we do. But fundamentally, the internet doesn't deliver physically. It delivers electronically very effectively, but it doesn't physically deliver products. And we still consume a great deal of physical product. And we can go back 65, 70 years and look at an innovation that is fundamentally driving the structure of economic development throughout the world. So shipping used to look like this. The gentlemen on the top right-hand side are called stevedores, and they used to work manually handling, securing cranes to pull, I think that looks like cotton, off trailers, okay? And this was an incredibly dangerous job. In every major port, about 4 people every single week were having life-changing injuries or dying as a result of their profession. It was an incredibly attritional place. Until Malcolm P. McLean came up with this idea of containerization. And you'll see the reason why I mention this containerization as we move through. But in the 26th of April, the Ideal X launched, sailed between Port Newark and Houston, and basically had 58 sea land containers. It was the first example of containerization. This moves on quite dramatically. If we just move forward to the late noughties and the early 10s, here's an example of a fully automated 6-gang crane system, which is shifting 54 containers, 40-foot or 80-foot containers per hour between ship and shore. And what's fascinating is they are completely automated. There is humans in the control tower, but there's lots of these at all parts of the port, and they're all working in unison, and they're all delivering these containers to these tracked automated electric guided vehicles to take to either for onwards or for stowing while they go through customs clearance. So Rotterdam is a particularly good example of a smart sort of port. And there's a huge amount of investment to achieve this, and you need to have huge volumes of containerization to facilitate this. And to make this happen, what you have ships, less than 53 years ago, the Encounter Bay could carry 1,500 containers, 40-foot containers. Moving forward to 2014, 2015, where there's 19,000 containers being shipped at one time. And the size of the ship that blocked the Suez Canal is kind of a 2013, 2015 scale size ship. And that basically has had huge impacts on the cost of sea transport. Okay, so another innovation is this concept of offshoring. Now this will all start making sense because the reason that these innovations have been adopted is because of pressures on that production function. And offshoring is just about relocating the production or manufacture of products from one country to another to improve profitability. And China recognized in the late 80s that it could be a manufacturing hub that would allow growth of its country through basically providing services for large, predominantly Western firms. And this is quite key. This is how Apple does most of its fabrication. They might design in the US, but they manufacture in Taiwan and China. Interestingly, in China, if you buy an iPhone, it doesn't say designed in the US. The Longhao employees rebelled and made them remove the Apple design in the US from the device. It just says iPhone. And the biggest advantage of this offshoring is that you reduce costs, so you maintain your profitability, because most brands and most companies try to work on a profitability scale. So Unilever, for example, or other similar multinational FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods providers such as Procter & Gamble, I knew the word would come to me, they work on about a 17 to 22% profit margin on everything they do. So that's why they produce in Poland, Hungary, Romania, because it reduces their cost of production, because soap is soap, and as long as you can ship it cheaply, it doesn't matter. And here's an example of a production line, similar to the production lines for semiconductors that we'd have seen in Wales in the 80s and 90s because of foreign direct investment made our location convenient for Korean and Japanese firms to actually co-locate production offshore of Japan or Taiwan or Korea in the United Kingdom for access to the European markets. Now, one of the issues with this is that when you invest in offshored, outsourced development, if the country that you invest in standards of living rise, then the cost of actually producing those products rises as well. And if we just compare 2009 with 2019, this is minimum wage development in China, RMB's renminbi, and we can see that in 2009 it was 960 renminbi, almost 2.6, 2.7 times greater in a decade. So the cost of producing anything in China has gone up by at least that much. So the benefits of offshoring are somewhat being removed because basically it's getting expensive to employ people in blue collar work. And typically what would have happened is that, you know, organizations would have moved closer towards less developed countries than China, so the Pakistans, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka or Nepal. And this is just a projection from the World Bank, and you can see it was flatlining from 2019 onwards. I don't know what's going to happen after the pandemic. I think the pandemic's had a fundamental impact on the way that countries see certain types of manufacturing and production. And if we want to take a look at a Western example, in the US alone in the last decade, 5 million very well paid manufacturing jobs were physically restructured, mostly to Mexico. Same argument, as part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, labor rates in Mexico are considerably cheaper than labor rates in America. It's very close to the constituent market. So it's a win-win for any firm that decides to undertake this activity. So there's lower wages, the workers don't have rights. In Longar, for example, you know, it's not uncommon for workers to be put in 16-hour shifts in. The suicide rate at these facilities is considerably higher than the national average for the countries. You know, there's cheap land to be made and there's very few environmental regulations. And this is really quite important because what it means is that the NIMBY generation, not in my backyard, allows lots and lots of dirty manufacturing to take place out of sight. So I grew up in a pit village in the South Wales valleys in the 60s and 70s. And basically my memories are of a dark, dusty, sort of dirty environment. We had a coke works where we produced coking coal for gasless, smokeless fuel for cities. So the smoke was in our area. We had several coal mines and we had some sort of steel manufacturing and processing plants in the area as well. And the environment was disgraceful. Very similar to this. This is China, obviously, and this is a result. And what we see is that in the UK now, we don't have those issues because a lot of those issues have been passed on to other countries to deal with. And what's key here, and if we think about the climate emergency, is that China produces the vast majority of its electricity through coal. To put this in context, the largest coal-fired power station remaining in the UK, and there's not very many of them left, is Drax. And Drax is a 4 megawatt producing power station. That produces about 7% of the UK's requirements for energy on a daily basis. In China, every 3 weeks, they are building a power station. So they're commissioning a power station. So it's going live on the network every 3 weeks of between 3 and 4 gigawatts. They've done it for the last 5 years. They're planning it for the next 5 years. So even though the Paris sort of Climate Accord is pushing towards sort of net zero carbon by 2050, one of the things that we're doing with this production offshoring is we're actually ceding control of that capability. And who are we to tell developing countries that they must change their behavior when 30 or 40 years earlier, we were doing exactly the same thing? And this has huge impacts in local communities. So this is an acid scarred environment. Again, very similar to, believe it or not, the Industrial Revolution in the South Wales valleys between 1780 and about 1850. I used to do some industrial archaeology research, and pictures like this, not of this scale, but pictures that look just like this were evident in much of the text I was reading. So there's an awful lot of sulfur and nitrogen oxides coming out of those plants. And again, it's not the sort of thing that we might want to see in the UK, but for the things that we consume, we see it. Anyway, that's enough of my green environment. We also see that industries start and stall. This is the example of the bike rental app sort of penetration into cities, and this is the classical case of markets trying to be generated. Now, I'm not saying that we should be trying to determine how free markets work, but some planning might be useful. So why have I spent 10 minutes talking about this? Well, just being able to transport and to offshore means that with reductions in transport costs, we get the penny and the bun. There's new opportunities for international trade. We saw that with Bangladesh, for example, and Nepal and other areas that we can move into, Vietnam as an example. It reduces the costs of foreign goods and allows distribution of manufacturing. So the location of manufacturing becomes much less relevant. And this is really shown here. If you think this is an example from a few years ago, which I haven't updated, and this is showing how many cameras you can get into one 40-foot shipping container. And the bottom line is that the cost of shipping that from the Far East to Europe or to North America equates to 2 cents or 1.5 pence per item. When you consider that a mobile phone is half the size of a box of a TZ60, you can see that the cost of shipping is not an issue. And even with the impact of the Suez Canal being closed and the fact that now a shipping cost is not $800 per 40-foot container, it's now more commonly $10,000, you can see as a proportion of a $500 or £500 selling price, 25 cents or 20 pence to ship it is not a fundamental issue. So the consequences, we get cheap goods from developed nations. We get the development of industry and the development of communities and societies in less developed environments. We get a proliferation of jobs for the incumbents within, the blue-collar jobs, and we get support indirectly for service jobs in more developed countries. But we also open Pandora's box. One of the things that is happening more recently is this concept of reshoring. So America moved a lot of its production to Mexico in the past 20 years or so. Some of that production is now coming back. If they've moved production to China, some of that production is now coming back. So if you think about this, this is just countries taking control of their key manufacturing assets. A good example of this is the Serum Institute in India, which produces about 65% of all the under 15 vaccines in the world. I've got a stat here somewhere which I find hard to believe, but I believe it's about 1.2 billion people get a vaccination from one company based in India. Now that isn't a problem because typically there's no impacts. What we've seen because of the Delta variant of COVID is that that same company has ceased exporting any of its vaccines. So this concept of reshoring is now being established by some countries for certain industries to ensure. And in America's case, the reason that America is moving towards reshoring is fundamentally because they have a huge amount of very cheap energy. As soon as they found their the tar sands, and they could become self-sufficient with petroleum again without having to rely on Saudi or South American production, at that point, they could offset the increase in paying for workers and they could move people back because their energy costs were reduced. So there's another very brief quiz, and the quiz-based question is very simple. So if you want to have a crack at this, please do, and I'll just check how much time I've taken whilst you undertake that. Okay. Let's have a look, see what response is, if we get any. Okay. let's switch back. So I'm going to move more now into the concept of digital transformation and what it means to UK industry. So this is an argument for UK digital transformation. This is part 3. So if we take a look at this particular graphic, what we can see is if we look at the biggest industries by revenue in the United Kingdom, we can see that supermarkets are by far the biggest, generating about $190 billion. Even though it's UK, I never understand why they express it in the universal currency of dollars, but they do. And you can see that hospitals are kicking in about 100 billion, and pension funding in the UK is quite significant as well. So we've got some big industries. And the reason for looking at this is if we take a look at the employment, then we can see that within supermarkets in the UK, 1.2 million people are employed. If you look at number 10, you'll see that universities in the UK, when this was taken, employed about 426,000 people. So the key point here, there's an awful lot of muda in the supermarket industry. There's a lot of waste through having to pay people to do jobs. And that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I'll come to that soon. Now, if we look at profit margins, these are companies or industries that don't have pressure. And if you just take a look at electricity, gas and water, so 1, 2 and 6, you can see that the margins that they work on are incredibly high. And it's no surprise that German, French and Chinese companies pretty much own electricity, gas and water distribution in the United Kingdom, because the profitability of those industries is incredibly high. That's offset a little bit by the government expecting electricity and gas to have sustainability drives. That takes some of that margin away, but it's still incredibly high margin. By comparison, Tesco would be very happy when its profitability is 5%. So out of every £100 that it sells, it's making £5 in profit. So its costs are £95, its profit are £5. So you can see there's very little margin for an industry with a huge number of employees to be working in. So digital transformation for that type of industry is really in the box seat. And if we take a look at this, if you look at the wholesale and retail trade, you can see that there's almost 5 million people in the United Kingdom that's actually sort of employed in that area. If you take a look at arts, entertainment and recreation, much, much smaller number. Manufacturing right near the top, 2.5 million people. So the point is that within retail grocery, there's a great opportunity to remove humans from the cost base. And this isn't new. Digital transformation has been happening in supermarkets for years. I had the pleasure of working up in the Dundee data centre for Tesco as they were implementing the club card solution. And we were desperately trying to work out how we could actually process 1% of the data that was coming in into meaningful sort of management information. So Tesco's been quite a sort of innovator in this area. And here's an example of digital transformation. If you can get the customer to serve themselves, that removes the need for a member of staff. And I was in Hayes recently, and one supervisor was looking after 16 checkouts. So instead of a human on a one-to-one, one supervisor could look after 16 checkouts, 16 times more efficient than the traditional way of purchasing. So this type of technology isn't unusual, okay? It's moving the work to the consumer, and some of us do that quite happily. This is a little bit more sophisticated. This is using some sort of scanning technology and probably some sort of digital scales technology to corroborate what's being scanned with what's actually in the bag in the same way that those self-checkouts will be. But in this case, you're not having to wait and scan at the end. You're doing it as you develop. The disadvantage of this is obviously this particular solution is a bit more expensive. And if they go walkies, they're much more difficult to maintain. So your cost base increases. Some examples of electric ink. This is somewhere in the Far East, and an advantage here, of course, is that you don't have to have members of staff wandering around the supermarket, changing prices, putting special offers on, discounts on. This is all done electronically, can be facilitated by head office if need be, and all these are updated. Then we move into some more esoteric areas. So instead of a supervisor wandering around looking for stockouts, here's a robot that's scanning the shelves to determine what elements and what picking lists needed from the warehouse. That's where I started my commercial career at 16, was in the warehouse of an Asda. And we used to sort of work through pick lists quite regularly. This is all automated. At the minute, humans would be needed to fill these shelves because they're not standardized. But moving forward, if machines can do it in some way, that will similarly magnify the improvements. And here's an example of augmented reality, something that sort of the marketing area gets very excited about. But the reality here is that, you know, the benefit really is to the provider of the technology, not necessarily the consumer, because whilst you're going through there, the provider will be looking at all your behavioral metrics and will be determining why and when you behave and where you eye scan, so they can optimize the profitability of the store, but a movement in a direction. The reality is that for the next 5 years or so, most of the innovation is going to come through smartphones. Wearable computing isn't established enough to do this, and smartphones are able to do the vast majority. And I was part of a pilot for a company which was trying to do this. The company actually sacked the project off because the shrinkage levels were too high and people were just ultimately relying on the person who's supposed to be assisting this sort of staffless solution to actually run the materials through the till. It was quite a hilarious thing ultimately. But this is kind of where that technology is going, and this is really where Amazon Go is establishing itself. So I said at the beginning that the pandemic has not necessarily been kind to supermarkets. Supermarkets are full of this very, very sophisticated technology. They've got e-commerce platforms, order and collect features, point of sale systems, order and collect features, click and collect, marketplace platforms. All this technology doesn't offset the fact that a typical grocer needs to use a human to pick the products that you have chosen electronically. And that impacts their profitability very significantly. They're not like Amazon. This is a robotized warehouse, and these robots basically are helping the picker pick the products from a pick list. So when I, as a consumer, order something, this is an automated way of getting the product to the picker, as opposed to the picker running around the warehouse. And these things can be the size of 20 football pitches with 4 or 5 different levels in them to actually facilitate the transaction. And here's an example where the robots are docking next to the picker. So the stowing, when the materials come in, are done by humans. The robots move them around so different pickers get them. The pickers still pick them. The packers still pack them. The sorters still sort them. There's lots of humans. Amazon, as I've said, have had to employ 500,000 additional staff, from 800,000 to almost 1.3 million in the last 18 months as a result of the pandemic. What they really want to do is they want to move away into automation, because automation is much more profitable. And whilst Amazon and Ocado can do this very efficiently, Tesco can't. So for every order that Tesco received that was a click and collect or an online delivery service, they were actually making a 4% loss. So every time they sold £100 worth of goods, they weren't making £5 profit, they were making £4 loss on it. That's not a sustainable way for the UK's, and at one point the world's biggest grocer, to be in. And that's a result of the fact that that's a traditional business that is trying to innovate, trying to remove humans from the mix, but it's not really designed like an Amazon or an Ocado. And even though we can see that the supermarkets for the last quarter to the 21st of March were taking considerably more revenue, that revenue wasn't translated into profitability for Tesco. So the important thing here is, as soon as the restrictions ended on April the 12th, Aldi and Lidl started biting into Tesco's market share. The other key thing to look at is Ocado. Ocado is tiny. It provides online services for Marks and Spencer's products. Basically, it's a 50-50 partnership currently. I think they used to work with Waitrose, but they're now working with M&S. And what we can see here is that our Ocado is a fraction the size of Tesco's. But when we look at market capitalization, what the company is worth in share value, we'll see something very different. Okay, so let's take a look at some robots in action. Hopefully this will work. It doesn't seem to want to work through the system. So I'm going to talk you through what should be a video. I have a horrible feeling that the video is not going to work in the next one either, which is very upsetting. So basically this is Andover. This is the picking center. It's got about 250,000 different storage boxes, and it's got well over 1,200 robots that whiz around these storage boxes, and each one of those storage boxes contains an SKU, a stock keeping unit. So that could be a roll of wrapping paper, it could be a bottle of tomato ketchup, Heinz tomato ketchup, or it could be a bag of sweet potatoes. But they're dashing around, and the system behind this is generating about 3 million different decisions every second to facilitate. Now, when I last looked at this, Ocado couldn't do this after the stuff had been picked. They still needed to use a human to pack the products. That's because the human hand is one of the most difficult things for technology to replicate. And the video that I would like to have showed you later, but doesn't seem to be working in this environment, is an example of soft robotics, and I'll try and explain that. But the fundamental truth here is that Ocado picks electronically. It doesn't use humans. Now, Amazon can't do that. The types of products that Amazon provides doesn't allow it to use a solution like this. It's a much more sophisticated solution that's required. So Amazon's been working with lots of robotics companies for well over a decade, and every year they have an annual competition where they set sort of challenges for these tech companies. And in about 2018, 2019, soft robotics caught Amazon's eye. And this is a really slick piece of robotics. This is the closest thing that you can get to a human hand. And what it is a pneumatically controlled system that uses the concept of octopus arms or legs, depending on how you want to view it. And it allows it to pick up all sorts of objects, all shapes, all sizes, all textures, in a way that a human hand can. But unlike a human hand, this machine can work 24/7, 365. And as long as you've got a production engineer on hand to maintain it and service it, it's going to keep on going for many, many years. And this is a big game changer. And Amazon's started a partnership with this particular technology company because Amazon sees this type of technology for stowing products that come in through the supply chain, off the containers, through the freight on the road and into their warehouses, to stow it into their storage boxes, and also sees it as a way of picking. So instead of having a human pick the object, whether they get to the point of packing, I don't know. I'm sure that they'll find a solution to that. But the point is, Amazon don't want 1.3 million employees. If Amazon could work with 400,000 employees, they'd be very happy because their profitability would be considerably greater. Apologies for the videos not working. And this is where we see the tech multiplier. If you take a look at the number of transactions that Ocado delivers in a week, it's about 334,000 on average. If you compare that with Tesco, it's about 14 million on average transactions a week. If you look at the revenue over the course of the year, you've got 2.3 billion versus almost 65 billion. So on a revenue scale, you can see that Tesco is orders of magnitude bigger than Ocado. But if we look at the value of the company, it's only worth about 3 billion more than a company that generates $500 million in sales in a quarter versus 8 billion in sales in a quarter. And this is the classical tech multiplier. And nowhere is this seen better than with Amazon. Here we have a company that's about 7 times bigger, 6.5 to 7 times bigger than Tesco, but its market capitalization is massively higher. I think that works out at 1,000 times higher. So we can see that this this future value of the company, this fact that they are digitally transformed and digitally enabled is taken upon by the markets, the capital markets, and makes them incredibly rich. And that means that they can borrow huge amounts of money very, very cheaply. And the other thing that's key here is that Ocado makes some of that revenue from leasing its technology. And Amazon, as you probably know, makes about 45% of that revenue from leasing AWS. So, you know, these have got sort of IP, intellectual property, that the market seems to perceive as being highly valuable. And that's why the market capitalization is there. And you can see this is Ocado. Ocado partnered with Marks and Spencer's about here. This is the start of the pandemic, and you can see that it's doing really well over the pandemic. If we take a look at, so that's just basically a share price evaluation. If we take a look at Tesco, we can see that Tesco doesn't show anywhere near the same shape. Don't worry about that dip. That was a share dilution. For every 6 shares that you owned in Tesco, they issued 7 shares, which meant that a share was only worth 6/7 of the original value. And that's why you get this dip and down. But you can't see any real improvement during the pandemic. And that's the market really sort of guessing what they want to invest in. I remember looking at Amazon shares about this time thinking, do I really want to invest £20,000 in Amazon at £1,000 a share? Looking at this now, perhaps the answer should have been yes, you should, Ian. And this is ultimately where this leads to. If Amazon can create an environment where the products in Amazon Go are stocked and are replenished automatically, then basically what they've got, with the exception of possibly some monitoring, is a human-free environment. So by combining computer vision, artificial intelligence, and smart sensors, as soon as you walk into an Amazon Go, it scans your phone, says, okay, you've got an account with us, you're either a Prime member or just a genuine typical Amazon customer with an account. There are 200 million Prime members. This is kind of a view to where this could go with physical distribution. So you're walking into a store. And the reason I say consumers should be concerned here is not because Amazon's doing anything which is unethical. It's just what Amazon's likely to do with the intelligence that they gain from the consumptive experiences. This is known as behavioral segmentation in marketing. And in the same way that you can track people's behavior before they come to your website or app and after they've been, you can do the same thing in these environments to optimize your performance. So the established incumbents like Iceland, how do they respond to this type of offer? Okay, so hopefully we've seen a view of why automation is particularly beneficial to the retail grocery environment, because if we can remove people from that environment, the profitability of those companies can be maintained. And we said that typically the margins, therefore the amount of profit they get to deal with, is quite small. Therefore, efficiencies that are brought by digital transformation are particularly useful. Now, what I want to do is just take a look at the society impact of what digital transformation may become. Okay, so these are using projections. So there's no absolute guarantee that any of this data is accurate, because some of this data comes from the UK government, and basically in the last 15 or 16 months, if you've been following the data issued by the British government, you might be thinking that there's some ambiguity in there. And this was a cartoon I spotted today talking about the veracity and reliability of that data, which I think encapsulates this quite well. But if we take a look at statistics from the Office of National Statistics, which is obviously a government-backed organization, we can take a look at some of these projections. And from the 2019 report, basically they've identified that in the UK now there are 1.5 million jobs at risk. So 7.4% of all the jobs in the UK as of 2019 are at high risk. Now, if we compare that to the 2016 analysis they did, the percentage at risk has been reduced. And the way that they argue this is that some of these jobs have already been automated. So the percentage that are left to be automated are much less. The highest risk professions include waiters and waitresses. That's partly because we now eat a lot more food on the go. It's actually a classification in the industry. So instead of eating fast food now or going to a Nando's, we might be going to a Greggs or equivalent. And so waiters and waitresses are less needed. Shelf filling has been identified as at risk. And elementary sales, especially if they're web enabled, we could just use some sort of chatbot in an environment to facilitate most of the typical questions that you may have when buying a slightly complex product, such as a new piece of technology, for example. The lowest risk professions include medical practitioners, HE teachers, and senior education managers. And I put those in on purpose just to sort of have a slight smirk. But even HE teachers, in the next 10 years, 1 in 5 jobs are expected to be removed from that particular area, i.e. 20% of jobs will be automated or digitally transformed in some way or another. And this is a really useful bit of data. And what this shows the spread of risk of automation for different types of profession. And if you look down the bottom at process, plant and machine operatives and elementary occupations, because of Industry 4.0, the new industrial revolution, they're projecting that, you know, upwards of 50 to 70% of people employed in those industries will no longer be employed. They will have their jobs automated. And we're going to cover this, and this is why the social responsibility element has been included. If you look at professional occupations, much less. So the knowledge workers persist because they do things that are much less easy to automate. The information they carry is much more complex, and therefore the transformative capabilities of information technology aren't quite as powerful. So I just thought I'd show you a few examples from here. So if you look at professional occupations, there we are, HE professionals, 1 in 5 jobs at risk of automation. Graphic designers, oh dear, over 1 in 3 at risk of automation. And if you use Canva lately, I'm a complete muppet when it comes to design, but I can actually create some quite functional graphic designs on Canva. You can see that I no longer need to use a graphic designer. I can do some of the basic stuff myself. Primary production, less so. Fishermen, still at risk. But if you're air transport operatives, if we start considering about biometric security, when we're checking in and using our boarding passes on planes, we'll probably be able to do that through some sort of technology as opposed to having an air transport operative. So we can see there's a wide spread, but we can see that jobs are at risk. What's interesting as well is the impacts are much stronger in certain demographics. So these are age ranges. So the millennials and the centennials in particular, what are known as Gen Zers, i.e. people under the age of 25, they tend to do the menial jobs that can be automated more easily. And similarly, the 55-year-old plus, as they finished one career and they may be going to part-time work, and my aspiration when I finished lecturing was to go and work for B&Q as a DIY helper. That's less likely to happen because there will be knowledge banks that will help customers as opposed to doddery old fellas like Ian. So we can see that there's a bit of a dichotomy in the impacts when it comes to age. But fascinatingly as well, I need to come to that, I've skipped one too far. If we look at the scale of the impact, 3% of jobs are at risk in totality by the early 2020s. The pandemic may have shifted that by a year or so, I don't know. But 30% of jobs at potential risk of automation by the 2030s, so that's 3 in 10. And low education automation by the mid-30s, 44%. So there's quite a large risk here. If we take a look at gender, women appear projectedly to be more at risk in wave 1 and wave 2, whereas men are significantly more at risk in wave 3 of automation. So even the gender balance of some of these impacts is sort of quite varied. So we've got age, we've got gender. And then when we think about trades, and this is fascinating, if we think about autonomous transport, and we can see that 50% of jobs in that industry are likely to be removed by autonomy by the mid-2030s. Now, these are all projections, but these projections all lead to the same sort of discussion. And that is, what do you do with the people who no longer have these blue-collar, lower-skilled roles? And this is where the argument for social responsibility comes in. And it's not just those that are lower skilled, it's those which are highly skilled but can have their jobs more easily divested. So this is Investec. This is a large finance company. They provide large commercial loans through brokers. And basically, they've got a team of 9 professionals who each earn between 60 and about £90,000 per annum, who actually profile the risk of those loan applications. So currently, this team of 9 is likely to be reduced to a team of 2 because a machine learning-based knowledge bank will remove 7 of them. So instead of Investec dealing with brokers, the technology will be dealing with brokers direct, and only human interaction will be used if decision is high complexity. This is not very different to the types of technology being implemented 20, 25 years ago when I was more active in industry. Now, fascinatingly, historically, the negative impacts have been offset by investment in education. But we can see that currently in the UK, there are 50%, 48 to 50%, sorry, of people that are eligible already in higher education. So this investment in education, if I was reskilled in the past, if I used to work in a pit and the pit closed, and I could then retrain to become a delivery driver, if that's automated, what do I then do? If I don't have the skills, what do I do? The other way it's been offset is by the safety net. Now in the US, it's called the safety net, and it's basically social security, what we would call the welfare state. And anybody who's followed this in the last 30 years will recognize that the welfare state in the United Kingdom is a shadow of its former self of 30 years ago when we had the last big disruption. And then we have this concept of a strong social contract. And interesting here, what we have to consider is, does the past equate to the future? And possibly, possibly not. So I've got about a minute left because I know I'm overrunning, I do apologize. This is an article from yesterday. And this is typical for the Tory graph. I read the Guardian, the Telegraph, and the Daily Mail to get a good balanced view of society. And basically, one of the responses that Elon Musk has been supporting is this concept of universal basic income. And this was first sort of considered by Thomas More in the book Utopia in 1516. And basically, the idea of universal basic income is you give unconditional money to every man, woman, and child. So it doesn't matter if you're working or you're not working, you get paid a sum. And for the people who aren't working, they pay taxes on the products that they consume. So therefore, they pay some back. And obviously, if you are working, you get this money, you get taxed more, you might consume more. So therefore, it feeds back. And we've kind of done that. The pandemic, through furlough in many European countries, has done this universal basic income. That's exactly what furloughing is. And in the US, you've seen enhanced social payments and stimulus checks. Okay, I'm going to skip the next 2 points and just take a look at the impact of debt as a percentage of GDP. So this is a statistic, and you can see the Second World War, 250% debt as a percentage of GDP. That was because we borrowed so much from the US to actually bail ourselves through that and to pay for activities. But if you take a look at 2008 onwards, that was the financial crash. That's when we started quantitative easing, and we went from about 35% debt as a percentage of GDP. In the last 18 months alone, we've now gone from about 80% to almost 100% of debt as GDP, okay? And basically what that's saying is, how is that universal basic income sustainable? And the fundamental truth is, when this goes wrong, when the social contract breaks down, as it did fundamentally in the late 70s, with the winters of discontent, you have a quite strong social response. And, you know, this is a typical image. Actually, it's quite a tidy image. Some of the images I could have chosen were quite difficult, which shows the impact of society when we become dysfunctional as a result of strategic change in the business. So I'd just like to finish by saying, welcome to Industry 4.0. Is this an interim stage in the transformation of society through digital manners? Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Ian. Are there any questions? You could either type them into the chat, or you're very welcome to unmute and just ask your question. I've got one to get us started, Ian. You were looking at sort of different industries, and you highlighted fishermen or fishing people. I mean, what sort of automation is likely to occur there? I mean, it's quite a physical job whilst out on the boats. Do you see it in the boats? Do you see it in another part of the industry?
I think it's going to happen in the production. So I think as the catch comes off, I think there'll be some automation in that part. So the factory worker stage, as opposed to the collecting of the fish, it will be the presentation of fish and the butchering of fish. I think that's where that's likely to occur. When I chose those professions, I spent about an hour just skipping through, because it's a drop-down list, and you can see all sorts of different sort of industries and the impact. And I was asking myself that question. I don't understand how primary producers, for example, could be impacted so significantly. But, you know, in a previous life, I was sort of associated with an open cast mine. And I do know that in sort of normal environments, it's quite easy to automate the extraction of ore and of materials like that, and use much fewer people than you would do if it's just transporting iron ore, for example, or lithium from the bottom of a pit to the top of a pit through some autonomous vehicles.
Okay. We got a couple of questions coming on chat. So there's one here from Colin. How does the rate of change from automation today compare with the 20th or even the 19th centuries?
Oh, that's a killer. I wish I had a statistic for you. I think that's a great question, Colin. I think what we see is we see accelerations and then pauses. So within my discipline, we see sort of bursts of activity that then sort of stabilize before the next burst of activity. So if we think about sort of smartphones as an example, realistically, for the last 8 years or so, the feature sets have been fairly standardized. And they've tried to innovate the space out of that to move it on, but they've not really achieved that yet. So I think it depends. You know, that was one of the points I made. You know, when I was working in IS, business process reengineering was incredibly, you know, basically, if you said you had a BPR solution, you could start minting millions of pounds worth of money because everybody was dabbling to it. But what I see of digital transformation is exactly the same thing. All you're doing is you're transforming processes in your business. So whether the speed is increasing, I don't know. But what unfortunately, because that video from Soft Robotics didn't work, what you're starting to see is that the capabilities that have, so should we say, throttled development are starting to be pushed through, and solutions are being found. And then it's just a case of implementing them more widely. For example, if you look at China now, there's an awful lot of what called black stores, lights out stores, you know, stores which are completely automated from the input to the output of that store. And if you just take a look at sort of companies such as Getir, which is it's kind of like a Deliveroo for groceries, you know, they're even using some of their 2 billion that they've raised in revenue to sort of consider how they could automate the solution of their system, basically, which seems a very complex thing to do. So I don't know. My gut feeling is that we've got acceleration in certain industries. I think we've got acceleration overall, but some industries are kind of, they peak quite early. So to peak again is going to take a while.
Okay, just to follow up on that one, I suppose. I mean, the one industry I think where there was lots of automation has been the car assembly line, where there was, and I'm trying to think of when would that have been, the 70s? Was that the 80s?
Yeah, late 70s.
Your late 70s, and was that over a few years? Was that over a decade? Do you have any recollection of that?
It gets progressively more sophisticated, doesn't it? What you end up with is automation. Basically, the simpler approaches will be automated, and then as you can remove people and use sort of robots of some kind, be they a crane carrying an engine as opposed to two people pushing it, they progressively develop. And the amount of investment required for some of these solutions is staggering. Amazon has an advantage because of its market capitalization, that it can just keep throwing huge amounts of money that Tesco just couldn't. Even if they wanted to, they can't do it. So Tesco has to do it much more organically because the funding model is different. So yes, these things occur over time. That's why when you look at the projections of the impact, the projections get much more strong as you get 15 years hence, because for humans, a 15-year window is something that you can start futurologizing about. I don't know, I was gobsmacked when I started identifying all these futurologists working for larger corporations now, trying to work out what exactly a futurologist does. I thought that was Mystic Meg and a glass ball on some sort of TV in the late 80s, early 90s. But yes, I think where you can mechanize, where you can automate, industries will be going there, because if they can and they solve it, it just makes them more competitive. If they're more competitive, they can capture more of the market. If they capture more of the market, they either buy out their competitors or they push them out organically into insolvency. And that's kind of John Lewis is where they're really struggling now. John Lewis is diversifying because they just can't compete. Even with their online solution, they can't compete with Amazon, which is quite a staggering thought when you think about the quality of that particular business and the revenue that business has generated for the last 30, 40 years reliably.
Yeah. Okay. So Ocado's process, so a question from Patricia, Ocado's process enables them to be highly dynamic and reactive. Do you see this happening more broadly, potentially offsetting some of the costs of change as demand changes?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges, and the reason I wanted to show the soft robotics demo was that how do you actually implement solutions when you've got very complex environments that you've got to implement them in? What Ocado's doing is, for anything that works on that suction system that they've probably got in the little robot that runs along those rails, anything that doesn't fit into that type of box will be done manually. Now, that's not a problem if you only carry 2,000 SKUs, because you can control that and manage that. If you think about Amazon runs about 12 million SKU, stock keeping units. So there's 12 million unique products that Amazon stocks. Not all in the UK, I'm talking across the world. So they're dealing with a huge sort of variety. By comparison, Tesco is about 90,000 products that it stocks in its biggest stores. So I think if you think about the grocery business, the Gettiers, for example, then they only really offer you 200, 250 products because they can't manage anything more. If you want a razor, you'll get a razor. If you want some tomatoes, you'll get tomatoes. If you want a loaf of bread, you'll get a loaf of bread. But if you want something esoteric for the garden, you're not going to be able to get it through that mechanism. And I think some of those niche areas are probably going to be more problematic. But where Amazon is hinting, it's suggesting to the market where it's going, will be very much to automate as much as possible. Because when they do, instead of employing 1.2 or 1.3 million people, they'll be employing considerably less. But it's a great question again, because, if you said to me 10 years ago, there'd be the concept of black stores, you'd sit there and go, well, yeah, okay, I get it. If you've got, a grocery distribution in the middle of a city that you want to do the delivery via, I get it. But with manufacturing now going to black stores, nobody in the distribution system being involved apart from monitoring, in China in particular, it's a very different world.
A question from Tally then. Are we saying that Argos has had the right high street approach all along and it just needed the automation to catch up with them?
Well, this is fascinating. The big problem is that footfall in CBDs, commercial business districts, is just dropping like a stone. And in marketing, place is fundamentally important. And one of the reasons that John Lewis is migrating away from their physical stores is that they don't think as many people will be using physical drop-ins. And that's quite key. And I don't know if this is accurate, but the projections are that the pandemic has accelerated the move to sort of, mediated distribution, buying online and having it delivered as opposed to popping to your local shops. And I think if those projections are correct, then Argus's model is broken, because Argus really then needs to be structured like Amazon, because running a warehouse on the edge or the confluence point of the M4 and the M5 is a much, much more efficient way of distributing products to millions of people than having separate shops, 1,000 or 1,500 separate shops, all having to run the same processes. The amount of control needed to make that work effectively is massive. So it's this classic innovator's dilemma. Amazon managed to do it. They were loss leading for well over a decade, but because they had the venture capital behind them, they could make all the mistakes, they could design themselves differently, and the incumbents were just making hay while the sun shined, and then all of a sudden we had a spectacular lack of sun.
Okay. There's one more question in the chat. Before that, David Jones has got his hand up. Hey, David.
Hiya.
Would you like to ask your question?
So if we have to standardize to enable automation, how do we differentiate between brands in the future? So if you look at something like Volkswagen and Audi, like when you step back from the cars are basically the same with different badges. So in the future, are we really relying on aesthetics to differentiate between brands?
Yeah, no, I think that's I don't know. I think it depends symbolically what a brand means to a person. So I think as long as there's demand, I don't think we're going back to the world of the Model T Ford, because that's just the simplest way to sort of deliver a product, especially now that we're moving to non-internal combustion engines as a form of propulsion. So I don't know whether we're getting an agglomeration of brands. The brands are getting bigger that are successful. So there could be a concentration, and we've certainly seen a concentration in the motor industry in Europe. You've got lots of companies now agglomerating because they want economies of scale and because they can't challenge the market leaders. So where that goes in the future, I don't know. But I think distinctive, what we call in marketing, symbolic brands, things that mean something emotionally to us. I drive an Audi because I want to be seen as successful. Perhaps we will have a rationalization, but I don't think we will remove what we call the premium or the prestige, the value and the low cost solutions in the market.
So it's purely about people's perceptions of a brand rather than the actual brand itself.
That's what I'm paid to do. I'm paid to make you think that something is better. Because the bottom line, as you know, is if you jump in a Skoda and you jump in an Audi and you want to go to London, they both get you to London.
Yeah.
And typically the Skoda is slightly more reliable because the technology is older. So therefore they've worked out all the problems. So you're likely to get them more regularly, reliably as well. But no, I want to be seen in an Audi. What's interesting there is the way that they've actually changed the pricing model. If you think now a typical car is £30,000, £25,000 to £30,000 for a mid-spec Ford Focus type thing, a Volkswagen Golf, that's a hell of a lot of money for us to pay. So what did they do? They just flexed the pricing. So instead of now me paying for the car outright, all I do is I lease that product for 2-3 years and I pay £300 or £350 a month. I could never afford it via a loan. It would just be too much if I wanted to buy over a 3-year period. So companies will always find novel ways to remove money from us reliably. That's for certain.
Sure, thank you. That's very interesting.
Okay, then we got a comment, from Neil on the chat. So I noticed pickers in a supermarket in Aber packing online orders in store to take them out to delivery vans. Seems crazy since someone else had already recently stacked the shelf in the store. But then what are they going to do? A big automated warehouse in Aber seems infeasible, but sending loads of small vans to Aber from the Midlands, say, warehouses is also not sensible. So there's not necessarily a question there. But.
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, that's what I was kind of saying. When I said the statistic about Tesco making a 4% loss on every product that was click and collect or delivered to home, I meant to mention that, you know, I was gobsmacked walking around Morrison's, seeing people with these very funny devices, obviously picking 3 lists at a time, 3 customers lists at a time, and the amount of time that those people must have spent. And that was the point. The point is that the incumbents are not designed to deliver that environment effectively. Tesco has always made a loss on its deliveries. You know, it's just been offset. But what Tesco doesn't want to do is it doesn't want to lose its customer to Ocado. So it has to be in the game. It's a Me Too strategy. So they have no option. And Morrison's is exactly the same. You know, they do click and collect. They do deliver in certain areas. The second part of your question gets to the crux of it. And I think this is the point about rationalization of what's being provided. You know, do you diminish the breadth of offers of product options? Because to do what Neil says near the bottom point is, yeah, you'd have to standardize on what people really wanted, because you couldn't carry the 90,000 units that you might in a large Tesco Extra. The whole model, and it really screamed, is completely broken for UK grocery. That's why I chose it. Because if you're going to see an area that's likely to undergo some sort of rationalization in the next decade, it's got to be that. Because if Amazon manages to penetrate the food market, and they're partnered with Morrison's, if they manage to penetrate that market, then all of a sudden things are going to change quite fundamentally, because they will do it in a very slick, profitable way. And companies like the Co-op and Tesco will just have to rely on people walking into the store. And if we take a look at the way that millennials, people under the age of 35, for example, have adopted Just Eat and Deliveroo, you know, the days of waiting in a takeaway to order your food seem to have gone, because millennials and centennials, they value their time much more than their value, and they're more than happy to pay £3 or £4 for that service. Even if it's having a McDonald's burger delivered, that to them is a useful use of their time. And it's a very fundamental change in the way that those consumers see the world.
Okay. And we got another question from Colin. So how much value do you think people might place on shopping at companies with less or no automation? For example, in the same way people choose to buy expensive organic food now.
Yeah, I think that's so. When you think about consumption, it's what you tend to do personally is you tend to frame consumption from your experience. So, for example, I express my consumptive practice by what I've learned over the last 30 years and the society and culture I lived in 30 years ago. So it's quite easy to think that there's a demand for those things. But what we'll see is that consumers get older every year, and those demographics, so the baby boomers and the Gen Xers are getting older and dying, and they're being replaced by the millennials and the centennials. So basically, that the chances of shopping in places with less automation are diminishing. Because if you get a better experience through automation, if you get the product that you want delivered to you within a day, then why would I try to find it in Aberystwyth? Why wouldn't I just say, okay, I'm going to just use Amazon, I'll get it in a day, that's fine by me. And that's a difficult, you know, how much, it's called loyalty. How much loyalty does the consumer have with the brand? So my parents are very loyal to certain supermarkets. I'm much more itinerant. So, you know, I'm not loyal to supermarkets, and that's a cultural thing. It's a great question, but just accept that time moves in a direction. And as the time moves, then so does consumptive practice. So even if it's not established early, by the midterm, it will become more established.
Okay, and a question from Tally then. So due to the logistical nightmare of our transport links, so the reason we lost B&Q here, and lack of large spaces, our area could suffer or be left behind, question mark.
Yeah, what you might find is you might find people migrating to this area because they want to live in an environment where there is logistical nightmares. But yes, any part of the country which is, should we say, further away from the main urban centres is going to be disadvantaged. So small rural towns are going to be much more disadvantaged than sort of larger industrialised, urbanised areas. What makes, what I didn't say is one of the reasons that Amazon is so highly successful is that, in 2007, they worked out how to be able to guarantee distribution in a time frame. And they ironed out all the problems that other companies said couldn't be ironed out. They launched Prime. They started then with next day or 48-hour guaranteed delivery. And at that point, companies like Argos had nowhere to go because, I could order on Amazon and pretty reliably receive it the following day. Argos responded with the next day delivery guarantee. We'll make sure it's in your store next day. The bottom line is that they can't carry the same amount of stock as Amazon. I'm not saying Amazon's a great company. Some of the stuff they do is terrible, but they do seem to have this customer focused sort of perspective that the customer gets a very good experience very reliably.
So are there any other questions that people would like to ask? David Jones, you got your hands up.
Back again. So I was just thinking about sort of Airbus and Volvo, how they switched to the service model, and then you have sort of the veg box deliveries and things. And do you think maybe actually the future is more about a subscription model to life, where you just go, got £1,000 spare a month and I want to eat, drive to work and stay warm, pitch to me what you can deliver for that.
The movement, from my perspective, the movement is that society seems to be moving towards experience economies. So they want what they want, the way they want it, how they want it. And any service provider that facilitates that requirement has an advantage, has a competitive advantage. The reason I picked on Amazon is that it has a strategic advantage in several ways. But yes, subscription models are fabulous. As a marketer, it's basically guaranteed loyalty. So instead of just having one sale, I can have 12 sales a year, or I can have 52 sales a year, depending on what the subscription is, and whether the value is appropriate for the audience. So I could join a gin club and every month have a bottle of gin and something else sent to me, but that would cost me 65 or 70 quid a month. If I'm happy to spend that for that experience, I'll persist with it. If Amazon then started offering the same gin club for 35 quid, I would move quite quickly because my loyalty would be undercut by a dramatic change in the pricing structures. And this is where automation just keeps on coming back. And that's why I started off with this idea of price. The reason that companies want to establish it and want to make it work is that it reduces the cost of them doing business. And where they reduce that cost, it just provides them competitive advantage. What I haven't covered is the learning curve. The capability of the company being able to do it and do it effectively. And as an ex-consultant, I used to charge out at about £2,500 a day to help companies do that. And I did a very bad job at it because what they were trying to circumvent was incredibly complex sort of environments, and it wasn't easy to fix. But as soon as you broach that and you sort that out, you've got an advantage. And again, that maps back to Amazon. Amazon could employ highly skilled people with very high salaries really early on. And the competitors like John Lewis that tried to do it 5 years ago don't, and they can't build up that, what we call an organizational intelligence quickly enough to be competitive. So really, when we talk about extinction level events, if you're in a business which Amazon is serious about, you've got a serious problem.
Isn't there, with Amazon in particular, there's this, they just suck in money from the economy and stick it offshore somewhere. So presumably long term that can't, if jobs are going and that money's going, at some point it breaks.
Yeah, well, this is key, and this is why I didn't mention this, but this is why in marketing we look at PEST-L forces: political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. And basically the legal and political forces are allowing these large corporations to do that. You know, take a look at corporation tax in Southern Ireland. You know, I think it's like 12% corporation tax. So what happens? North America wants to embed their companies in Europe. Where's the best place to do it? Southern Ireland. Why? Well, principally Dublin, because the amount of corporation tax they pay is even less, even though they've got all these different ways of getting around it. So yeah, you know, that's why I said the way I'm looking at it is one Stalin in a murmuration, because as soon as you start looking at this politically, you know, it starts looking really difficult to understand. And then as soon as you start looking at economically, it gets really difficult to understand, because it's such a highly complex, interrelated sort of fabric that it's really, really very difficult to unpick. And I could have gone in lots of different directions. I just chose an easy direction for myself, because it's a Friday night and I'm looking forward to a beer.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Perhaps we have time for one final question, if anybody has that. We're approaching 8 o'clock. Okay. Well, Ian, I'd like to thank you for a really interesting talk, and thank you for your time on this Friday evening. So if everybody else would like to, I'm sure they'd express their thanks as well. Just a couple of final comments then. So thank you to everybody for coming, and hope you have a good evening. The one thing to say though, tomorrow the BCS, the Mid-Wales Branch, which is running this, we've got a programming contest tomorrow, and I'm just going to paste a link into the chat, and that's either join as an individual or join as a team of 3. Some programming fun, some tasks to do between 12 noon and 4 p.m. It's all online. It's free to enter. There's some prizes for sort of team and individual, and at that link you'll find a bit more information. Okay, so thank you again to Ian, and thank you to everybody, and I hope you have a good evening and a good weekend.
Thank you very much.